The scuffed blue toddler's shoe on the porch was 3 sizes too small to be hers, its laces knotted with a frantic, amateur clumsiness. Julian stood before the peeling door of the suburban house, listening to the muffled sound of his wife singing a lullaby he used to play on the Steinway she had abandoned 5 years ago. He reached out, his bespoke wool coat suddenly suffocatingly heavy, and pressed his palm against the rotting wood, feeling the vibration of a life that had dared to continue without him. Some ghosts don't haunt graveyards. They build new homes in the quiet corners of the world, waiting for the past to finally knock. The rain in Portland didn't fall. It hung in the air like a cold, wet breath. Julian Sterling sat in the back of the idling town car, the leather seat holding him with the stiff formality of a boardroom chair. Outside the tinted glass, the neon sign of the Flour Dust Bakery flickered, casting a sickly pink glow onto the wet pavement. 5 years, 100 private investigators, $3 million in retainer fees. And she was here, tucked between a laundromat and a defunct hardware store, smelling of yeast and ocean salt instead of the Tom Ford vanilla he used to have imported for her. He adjusted his platinum cufflink, twisted it once, twice. A habit born from boardrooms where he dismantled centuries-old corporations without a spike in his heart rate. But now his pulse was a frantic, irregular drumbeat against his collar. Julian pushed the heavy door open. The Maine wind bit through his bespoke coat immediately. Sharp reminder that he was out of his jurisdiction. He crossed the street. The bell above the bakery door was a dull, brassy chime, nothing like the crystal resonance of their Fifth Avenue penthouse elevator. The shop was empty of customers. It smelled intensely of burnt sugar and dark roast coffee. Behind the counter, standing with her back to him, was Clara. She was wiping down the espresso machine. The repetitive circular motion of her hand was hypnotic. Her hair, once meticulously salon-blown into submission, was a chaotic knot at the nape of her neck, held together by a wooden chopstick. She wore a faded gray oversized sweater that swallowed her frame. Julian stopped at the edge of the display case. He didn't speak. He wanted to hoard this moment to catalog the architecture of her survival before he tore it down. "We're closed," she said, her voice rougher than he remembered, snagging on the edges of the quiet room. "The register is already counted down. If you want day-old sourdough, it's in the basket by the door. Leave $2. She didn't turn around. She was so entirely unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath her feet. "I don't eat sourdough, Clara," he said. The rag stopped moving. It was a microscopic freeze, a glitch in the machinery of her life. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crack the glass separating them. Julian watched the line of her shoulders stiffen. He remembered how those shoulders felt under his hands, delicate as sparrow wings, trembling when she cried in the dark. They didn't look like they trembled anymore. Clara turned slowly, her eyes, a pale, startling gray, locked onto his. And he expected a scream. He expected terror, or at least the violent shattering of a woman caught in a lie. Instead, she looked at him with the vacant, unreadable expression of someone recognizing a stranger who owed her money. "Julian," she breathed. It wasn't an exclamation. It was a receipt. Before he could speak, before he could unleash the rehearsed monologue of ownership and betrayal he had polished for half a decade, a sound derailed the air in the room. "Mama?" The voice was small, sticky with sleep. From the back room, pushing through a heavy canvas curtain, a child appeared. A boy, no older than 4, dragging a faded blue stuffed elephant by its trunk. He wore mismatched socks and a pair of worn denim overalls. Julian's breath stopped in his throat. It felt as if he had swallowed glass. The boy stopped walking, and he looked at Clara, then turned his wide, unblinking gaze to the towering man in the dark coat. Julian stared at the child. The structure of the boy's jaw, the slight, arrogant curve of his lower lip, the dark, almost black hair curling at the temples. It was like looking into a temporal mirror. It was looking at the ghost Julian had mourned, the child Clara had wept over in a sterile hospital room before she vanished. "Mama, who is the man?" the boy asked, rubbing an eye with a small, flour-dusted fist. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't look at Julian. She reached over the counter, lifting the heavy boy into her arms with a practiced, effortless grace that Julian had never seen her possess. She pressed the boy's face into the crook of her neck, shielding him from the cold draft of the door. "Nobody, Leo," Clara said, or her voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying calm. Her eyes finally met Julian's over the boy's dark hair, hard as concrete. "Just a man who got lost in the rain?" Julian stood paralyzed, the scent of burnt sugar turned to ash in his mouth. The world he had rigorously controlled, the narrative he had written where he was the grieving, abandoned husband, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on the bakery floor. She hadn't just run from him, she had stolen his legacy. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy, final click, sealing the bakery from the coastal street, but the temperature inside the room had already dropped. Clara stood by the front door, her fingers resting on the cold brass lock. She waited until the taillights of the idling Maybach finally bled into the fog and vanished from the neighborhood. Only then did she exhale. She moved to the back kitchen, untying her apron with stiff, mechanical movements. She drove the heels of her hands into a 50-pound mound of sourdough starter on the stainless steel prep table. Push, fold, turn. The physical labor was a metronome, a rhythm that kept her mind from splintering. 4 years of this rhythm, 4 years of building a new spine out of flour, water, and sheer, unadulterated stubbornness, only for it to be undone by the dull chime of a doorbell. 3 hours later, the knock came. It wasn't the frantic tapping of a local looking for late-night scraps. It was 3 measured, evenly spaced strikes against the frosted glass. A demand, dressed as a request. Clara didn't stop kneading. She knew who it was. Ignoring Julian Sterling never made him leave. And it only made him acquire the ground you stood on. She wiped her hands on a linen towel, walked to the front, and turned the deadbolt. Julian stepped inside, bringing the biting Maine wind with him. He had shed the overcoat, revealing a tailored charcoal suit that looked aggressively out of place against the peeling paint of the shop. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked the perimeter of the small customer area, his expensive leather shoes silent on the scuffed linoleum. He was taking inventory, cataloging her meager kingdom. "He sleeps through the night?" Julian asked, his back to her, examining a chipped ceramic mug on a display shelf. It was a simple question on the surface. Beneath it, a ledger was opening. "I have been sitting in a car for 3 hours thinking about the thousands of nights you stole from me." He's a heavy sleeper," Clara said. She returned behind the counter, putting the width of the wooden register stand between them. "Like my father." Julian paused. The mention of her father, a man Julian despised for his catastrophic financial ruin, was a calculated strike. He turned, the ambient streetlight catching the sharp, predatory angle of his cheekbones. "You traded a life where you never had to touch a door handle, Clara, for this." He gestured loosely to the brown water stain on the ceiling. "To scrape dried yeast off a floor. Why?" "My hands were getting too soft," she said, her voice entirely flat. "You were safe," he countered, stepping closer to the counter, invading the airspace she had painstakingly claimed. "You were completely protected. A vault is safe, Julian. It's also airtight." He stopped, and the muscle in his jaw feathered. He hated metaphors he didn't construct. "It must have been remarkably difficult," he said, his tone dropping an octave, sliding into the smooth, frictionless register he used during hostile corporate takeovers. "Disappearing into the night, setting up this squalor, especially when your sister suddenly couldn't afford to loan you the money for a bus ticket, let alone a security deposit." Clara's hands, resting on the counter, went perfectly still. Julian watched her fingers. He lived for the micro-expressions of a collapsing opponent. He stepped flush against the display case, the glass fogging slightly from his breath. Sarah told you her gallery was failing, didn't she? That the bank was calling in her loans. That she simply had nothing to spare when you showed up at her door crying. Julian tilted his head, his eyes dark and merciless. It's astonishing how quickly a struggling business finds an anonymous, aggressive investor right when the owner's sister needs to learn a lesson about how cold the world is. The air in the bakery crystallized. He hadn't just watched her struggle, he had engineered the drought. He had bought her family's silence to ensure she had no safety net, no warm bed to run to except the one he owned. He had wanted her to starve just enough to crawl back. "The world is vicious, Clara," Julian whispered. For a fraction of a second, the polished veneer of his voice cracked, revealing the raw, unhealed wound of a boy who had been left behind too many times. "I needed you to understand that I was the only solid ground. Oh, I did it so you wouldn't get hurt." Clara looked at him. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The absolute absence of her tears terrified him more than any hysterical outburst could have. She turned slowly to the butcher block behind her. She picked up the heavy 10-inch serrated bread knife. Julian's spine snapped straight. A primal, defensive tension gripped his shoulders, but Clara didn't raise the blade. She walked back to the counter, flipped the knife, and extended her arm, offering him the smooth wooden handle. "If you want to cut me off from the rest of the world, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than a shout, "you don't need to buy my sister's gallery. You don't need to manipulate bank loans." She held the knife steady, perfectly suspended between them. "Just do it yourself. It's faster." Julian stared at the offered handle. For the first time in 5 years, the architect of a billion-dollar empire had absolutely no idea what to do with his hands. He looked from the knife to her face, searching for a bluff, finding only a devastating, hollow resignation. The violence of her submission was a mirror he couldn't look into. He took a slow step backward, leaving the knife hanging in the empty air. The bread knife was back in its wooden block, the steel wiped clean of the tension from the night before. Morning in Portland crept in gray and hesitant, washing the bakery in the muted light of a bruised sky. Clara flipped the open sign. It hummed, a low, electric vibration that settled into the damp floorboards. The door chime rang at exactly 6:30. Julian did not look like a corporate raider this time. He wore a simple cashmere sweater, the dark wool absorbing the ambient chill of the room. In his right hand, he carried a paper cup. It wasn't from her shop. It was from the artisan roaster 3 blocks down, a place he would have had to research and walk to in the freezing dawn. He set it on the counter. The cardboard sleeve was warm against the chilled glass of the display case. "Cortado," he said, his voice stripped of the gravel it carried the night before. "Oat milk, a 1/4 teaspoon of cardamom, served at exactly 140 degrees so it doesn't scald the tongue." Clara stared at the small plastic lid. She had not had that exact drink since a Tuesday morning in Manhattan, 5 years ago. It was an extravagant, hyper-specific order she used to make in their penthouse kitchen while he read the financial markets. And it was the taste of a time before the walls had fully closed in, before love became a high-security prison. She reached out. Her fingertips brushed the warm paper. For a fleeting, dangerous second, the heavy armor she had worn for half a decade felt terribly burdensome. She looked up at him. His eyes were softer now, stripped of the predator's gleam. He looked incredibly tired. He looked like the man who used to stay awake just to watch her breathe when she had a fever. "You remembered the cardamom," she said, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the refrigerator. "I remember the exact pitch of your cello when you tuned the A string," he replied quietly, keeping his hands anchored to his sides. "I remember the way you fold your napkins. I have never forgotten a single detail about you, Clara." The bakery smelled. Just for a moment, like forgiveness. It smelled like the possibility that the chasm between them could be bridged by a paper cup and a shared memory. The silence beat out a slow, tentative rhythm. Clara brought the cup to her lips. The cardamom was perfect, a bitter, aromatic ghost sliding down her throat. Julian gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A truce, signed in roasted beans. He turned toward the door to leave her to her morning rush. As he pivoted, his gaze caught the delivery pallet near the back kitchen frame. A 50-pound bag of rye flour sat precariously on the top shelf of the storage rack, delivered late the night before. It was heavy, but Clara moved them twice a week. She knew the leverage. She knew the exact angle to tilt the weight against her hip. Julian didn't ask. He didn't pause to consider her capability. He simply stepped behind the counter, violating the boundary of her workspace with the casual entitlement of a landlord. He reached up, his cashmere sweater stretching across his broad shoulders, hauled the massive sack off the top tier, and dropped it onto the floor with a dull, heavy thud. A plume of white dust kicked up, settling onto the toes of his expensive shoes. He brushed his palms together, a crisp, final sound. "That was too high for you," he stated, not looking at her, already adjusting his cuffs. "You could have torn a ligament." He walked out, the door chime ringing his exit. Clara stood perfectly still. The warmth of the cortado in her hand suddenly felt like poison. The illusion of the morning evaporated, leaving behind a cold, suffocating vacuum. He had not helped her. He had erased her. He had looked at her life, her business, her physical reality, and decided instantly that she was still too fragile to manage it without his intervention. She looked at the heavy bag on the floor, now blocking her path to the oven. She didn't drink another drop of the coffee. She turned, walked to the sink, and poured the perfect, remembered cardamom cortado straight down the drain. The 50-pound sack of rye flour remained exactly where Julian had dropped it until noon. Clara finally dragged it to the pantry herself, feeling the dull, necessary burn in her lower back, a physical confirmation of her own autonomy. The afternoon sky over Portland turned the color of oxidized iron by the time the brass bell above the door chimed again. It was Julian, and he was not empty-handed. He carried a black, crushed velvet case, and the heavy brass clasps gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bakery. He navigated the narrow aisle with the case held out in front of him, treating it with a reverence he rarely afforded living things, and set it carefully on the only clean table in the customer area. Leo was sitting under the front counter, humming a tuneless song to himself while coloring a paper plate with a dull green crayon. "I had this flown in from a private dealer in Vienna," Julian said, his voice carrying a fragile, manufactured warmth that didn't reach his eyes. He unlatched the case. The interior was lined in royal blue silk. Inside lay a half-sized cello, carved from flamed maple, its antique varnish glowing like spun honey even in the dim room. It was a museum piece, and a $40,000 instrument for a 4-year-old child who was currently trying to see what a crayon tasted like. "He has your hands, Clara," Julian murmured, looking at the boy beneath the counter. "It's time he learned. I've already contacted the first chair of the Portland Symphony. He's willing to take a private student." Clara stopped wiping the espresso machine. The damp rag fell from her grip, landing on the stainless steel drip tray with a wet slap. The air in the bakery thinned, rushing out through the invisible seams of the windows. She looked at the cello. It wasn't a gift. It was an anchor. It was Julian hauling the suffocating weight of their past across state lines and dropping it directly onto her son's small shoulders. "Close the case, Julian." "The bow is crafted from Pernambuco wood, Clara. It's exceptionally balanced for a beginner." "Close it." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried the terrifying high-tension hum of a snapping steel cable. Julian looked up, genuinely confused. He had brought music back into her life. He had provided the absolute best, just as he always did. "I am trying to give my son what he deserves, what you used to love. You are trying to purchase a timeline that doesn't exist," she said, stepping out from behind the register. She didn't look at the magnificent instrument. She looked at the man who thought he could buy his way out of a burning building. You don't want a son. You want a replica of the wife you broke, assembled exactly to your specifications. I never broke you. I insulated you. The words fired back instantly, a deeply ingrained defensive reflex. I built a wall so high the world couldn't touch you. I kept you entirely safe. Clara let out a short, hollow sound that barely qualified as a breath. A fortress with no doors isn't a sanctuary, Julian. It's a tomb. She walked toward the table, her flour-stained apron brushing against his pristine suit pants. She stood inches from him, her gray eyes flat and devastating. Sarah didn't tell me about her gallery failing, Clara said, the words precise and surgical. She lied to my face and told me business was just slow. I found the foreclosure hold notice on her desk the day I left you. The lien holder wasn't her bank. It was a subsidiary holding company. She paused, letting the silence expand until it pressed against his eardrums. A company registered as Sonata Capital. Julian's breath caught. The name hung in the air, on a grotesque, arrogant monument to his absolute control. You bought my sister's debt, Clara whispered, stepping even closer, forcing him to smell the yeast and sweat on her skin. And you threatened to liquidate her gallery if she gave me a place to sleep. You didn't protect me from the cold. You bought all the coats in the city and burned them, just so I would have to crawl into your pocket to survive. Because they would have bled you dry. Julian's voice suddenly cracked, the volume filling the small room, a raw, ugly sound that made Leo drop his crayon and scramble backward. Your family saw you as an ATM, Clara. My father let his brothers siphon our accounts until we didn't have money for heating oil. I watched my mother freeze in her own house because she was too weak to cut off parasites. I swore no one would ever leverage you. I secured the perimeter by becoming the only predator allowed in the yard. The words hit him like physical trauma. Julian stumbled back a half step. He looked away from her face, his gaze desperately seeking a neutral surface, and landed on the large, unlit glass door of the commercial baking oven behind the counter. The dark glass acted as a crude mirror. In the dim reflection, Julian didn't see the tailored CEO or the desperate savior he believed himself to be. He saw a man towering over a smaller woman, his shoulders hunched aggressively forward, his jaw locked in the exact, terrifying posture his father used to take before a dinner plate was shattered against the wall. He saw the monster in the dark. The realization paralyzed him. He had spent his entire adult life running from his father's violent shadow, only to realize he had meticulously built his own house precisely in its center. The silence beat out a slow, agonizing rhythm in his chest. Leo ran out from under the counter, darting past Julian's legs to bury his face in Clara's apron, trembling. Julian stared at his son, hiding from him. He slowly reached out, his hand shaking so violently the platinum cufflink rattled, and closed the velvet lid over the priceless cello. The heavy brass clasp snapped shut, sounding exactly like a lock sliding into place on a prison cell. Clara did not look at the black velvet case again. She placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, her touch light but absolute. She guided the boy toward the heavy canvas curtain separating the storefront from the back kitchen. "Go to the office, Leo," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle or steady hum that entirely masked the violent tremor in her chest. "Put the large headphones on and look at the dinosaur book. Do not come out until I open the curtain." The boy looked at his mother, then at the tall man standing rigidly by the display case. He didn't argue. He disappeared behind the thick fabric. The silence that followed was heavy, metallic, and expectant. It was the sudden vacuum of air right before a structure implodes. Julian stared at the space where his son had been. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals. The revelation of his own tyranny, reflected in the oven glass seconds ago, was violently warring with the deeply entrenched narrative of his own victimhood. Even if I bought the debt, Julian said, his voice a low, ragged scrape against the quiet room. Even if I orchestrated the perimeter, and it does not balance the ledger, Clara. He stepped away from the counter, moving toward the center of the room, needing space for the sheer volume of the betrayal he had carried for 5 years. You stood in that hospital room, he continued, the words accelerating, driven by a sudden, desperate anger. You held my hand, looked me in the eye, and told me the ultrasound was silent. You let me buy a plot in a cemetery. You let me stand in the freezing rain staring at a marble stone with no name on it. I mourned a child that was currently breathing in your womb while you boarded a Greyhound bus. Why? Clara stood perfectly still. The damp rag on the espresso tray stopped dripping. Because it was the only way to keep the heartbeat mine, she said. Julian recoiled as if she had struck him. It was my child, too. And I had a right. You forfeited your right to my body the day you decided it was defective machinery, Clara cut in. Her voice didn't rise to a shout. It did something far more terrifying. It dropped into a clinical, absolute coldness. Julian froze. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, chalky pallor. What are you talking about? I didn't leave because I found the bank records, Julian. I left because I went into your study to find my passport, and I found a blue medical folder from the Kensington Clinic instead. The air left Julian's lungs. The entire bakery seemed to tilt on its axis. A contract, Clara said, stepping out from behind the register, erasing the physical distance between them until she was close enough to see the frantic pulse beating at the base of his throat. A fully executed contract, on $200,000 deposited into an escrow account for a woman named Elena in Seattle, to carry an embryo. Clara, you were anemic, Julian stammered, the smooth corporate tactician entirely obliterated. Your heart rate dropped during the first trimester scare. The specialist said a full-term pregnancy had a 30% chance of triggering a fatal cardiac event. I wasn't going to let you die to give me an heir. I was saving your life. So you forged my signature on a genetic transfer consent form? The question hung in the air, sharp and glittering. I protected you, Julian whispered, the words sounding hollow, even to himself. You outsourced me, Clara corrected. You looked at my body, calculated the risk, and decided to replace the parts without consulting the owner. And you were going to let me believe I couldn't carry a child, and then you were going to hand me a newborn and tell me it was a medical miracle. You were going to orchestrate my entire motherhood from a boardroom. I was giving you the family you wanted without the danger. Julian's voice cracked, a desperate plea for her to understand the terrifying mathematics of his love. I took the burden. I made the hard choice so you wouldn't have to. You took my agency. Clara's eyes were dry, burning with a clarity that stripped him to the bone. You took my right to choose my own risk. You didn't want a partner, Julian. You wanted a vintage car. You wanted to keep me perfectly polished in a climate-controlled garage, completely safe and entirely useless. She took a breath. It was the only sound in the room, harsh and vital. Oh, you practiced my cursive, she whispered, the intimacy of the violation making the words almost unbearable. I saw the notepad in your drawer. You sat at your mahogany desk and practiced the loop of my C until it matched mine perfectly. You didn't just steal my choice. You stole my name. A long, suffocating silence beat through the room. Outside, the main rain shifted from a drizzle to a sudden torrential downpour, hammering against the large storefront windows like a barrage of small stones. Julian looked at his own hands, the same hands that had held her when she was shivering with a fever, the same hands that had meticulously forged her identity on a legal document because he believed he was a god who could rewrite biology to keep his universe intact. He had not saved her. He had erased her. He had loved her with a violence disguised as salvation, and in doing so, he had engineered his own total destruction. "I loved you," Julian said to the scuffed linoleum floor. It wasn't a defense anymore. It was an obituary. "You loved your ability to keep me alive," Clara replied, turning her back to him. The absolute finality of the movement was heavier than a slammed door. "That is not the same thing as letting me live." She walked back to the counter, picked up the damp rag, and resumed wiping the stainless steel. The mechanical, circular motion returned. The rhythm of a woman who had already survived the worst thing he could do to her. The mechanical whir of the espresso machine finally stopped, leaving a vacuum so profound it made Julian's ears ring. The silence that rushed in to fill the bakery was absolute, in heavier than the torrential Maine rain battering the front windows. He did not move to touch her. The terrible, undeniable gravity of his own actions pinned him to the scuffed floorboards. He looked at her back, the sharp, uncompromising line of her spine beneath the oversized gray sweater. It was the posture of a woman who had already attended his funeral, grieved the loss, and swept up the ashes. He was a ghost, haunting a life that had actively chosen to breathe without him. Julian reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal jacket. His fingers, which had directed international mergers and casually dismantled inherited dynasties with a single keystroke, trembled uncontrollably as they pulled out a silver fountain pen. He took a blank commercial order pad from the stack near the register. When the scratch of the platinum nib against the cheap, thin paper sounded violently loud, a jagged tearing of the quiet room, he wrote 4 sentences, a complete legally binding relinquishment of paternal rights, an absolute non-disclosure of her location, and a formal transfer of the Sonata Capital shares tied to her sister's gallery. He sealed it with the exact aggressive signature he had once used to forge her medical consent. He placed the paper next to the crushing weight of the black velvet cello case. Julian turned and walked out into the freezing storm. He did not look back through the fogged glass. The driver immediately opened the heavy armored door of the idling Maybach. Julian slid into the cavernous rear seat. The air inside was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling of new leather, ozone, and sterile luxury. And the door thudded shut, sealing him inside the vault he had spent his entire life building. "The airport, Mr. Sterling?" the driver asked, his voice routed respectfully through the intercom. Julian did not answer right away. He looked at the empty expanse of the leather seat beside him. It was immaculate, untouched. He had successfully secured his perimeter. He had neutralized every threat, eliminated every variable, and bought every exit. And as the car glided smoothly away from the curb, a suffocating, paralyzing terror clamped around his lungs. He was going back to a 50-story glass tower where hundreds of people would anticipate his orders, where his wealth could alter skylines. But not a single living soul would know to leave a glass of warm water on his nightstand because he woke up coughing at 3 a.m. No one would know that he kept the closet light on because the absolute dark reminded him of his father's footsteps. He had traded the only witness to his humanity for a flawless, unbreakable mirror. The engine hummed, carrying him safely into a permanent and absolute isolation. Inside the bakery, Clara heard the faint, luxurious purr of the engine fading down the coastal highway, swallowed by the sound of the rain. She didn't rush to the window to watch him leave. She finished wiping the stainless steel counter, deliberately folding the damp rag into a perfect, symmetrical square. Only then did she walk over to the register and look at the paper he had left behind. She read the sharp, familiar angles of his handwriting. Her throat tightened, a sudden fierce ache blooming behind her ribs, but she did not cry. The time for weeping over Julian Sterling had been spent on Greyhound buses and in cheap motel bathrooms. She simply folded the heavy cream paper twice and slid it under the plastic cash register tray, burying $1 billion surrender beneath $5 bills and loose quarters. Clara walked to the back room and pulled back the thick canvas curtain. Leo was sitting on the floor, the oversized headphones slipping off one ear, intensely focused on a battered picture book of dinosaurs. He looked up, his dark eyes, so terrifyingly like his father's, searching her face for the weather. "Time to prep the morning dough, little bird," she said, her voice entirely steady, anchored by the immediate physical necessity of the present. Leo scrambled up, abandoning the book, and reached for her. She lifted him, resting his solid, warm weight against her hip. His small fingers dug into the flour-dusted wool of her sweater. Her shoulder ached from the leverage, but it was her ache, earned, claimed. She carried him to the heavy butcher block, grabbed a handful of raw flour, and let him scatter it across the wood, watching the chaotic, imperfect snow settle. Hours later, after the massive ovens were programmed for the dawn bake and the streetlights flickered against the wet pavement, Clara walked to the front door to lock the deadbolt. She turned to switch off the display lights and paused. There, resting against the base of the counter, was one of Leo's scuffed blue toddler shoes, its laces knotted with a frantic amateur clumsiness. She picked it up, her thumb brushing a dusting of flour from the worn canvas. When she didn't leave it on the threshold for ghosts to find, she carried it with her, placing it securely on the bottom step of the stairs leading up to their apartment. Then she walked back into the quiet kitchen and poured a single cup of black coffee. The steam rose in the dim light, hot, bitter, and entirely hers.